The European Union's carbon taxes on imports have affected South Africa, affecting 350,000 jobs and potentially 10% of the local economy. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism aims to encourage low carbon production and reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. Patrick Bond, who's a distinguished professor and director of the UJ Centre for Social Change, joins us to expand on the conversation. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. 350,000 jobs on the line, and the impact could be massive. Talk to us, help us make sense of this.
I think that's probably quite an exaggeration. First, thanks for having me, because this society needs to debate. Should our very, very dirty, high carbon intensive, but also high capital intensive industry still get the huge benefits from Eskom, such as 30 cent per kilowatt hour electricity for the biggest smelter, the one up at Richards Bay, making aluminium, where the profits go back to Melbourne, to the BHP Billiton headquarters. So I'm certain a little plant like that, which uses 7% of our electricity, but only has 1,200 jobs, I'm certain that if you add all of that up, what's at risk from the European import tariffs, these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, won't do what the Reserve Bank economists have been predicting. I think actually we might have an economic boom that would result from moving the electricity from smelters of that sort, and from Sasol, and from perhaps in the future some of the auto plants, to labor-intensive industries and small businesses. So I take a very different point of view. The 350,000 job losses is just a scare tactic.
Okay, with that in mind, I mean, how has it been exaggerated? You give us an idea of the overall picture, but the exaggeration, how much of an impact could it have? Will jobs be affected at all? Or are you saying that 350,000 jobs is a bit much?
Yes, that's actually the entire amount of jobs that the energy-intensive users groups has. It's 27 companies, and they use 42% of our electricity and about 4% of our employment. So we're really talking about as if all of the heavy industry would be wiped out. It won't be, because there'll be plenty of other markets. But if we can move the electricity used by these companies, especially BHP Billiton and ArcelorMittal and Sasol, the big ones in aluminium and steel and petrochemicals, we move it to labor-intensive industry. We move it to small businesses. We move it to the households who are being disconnected now. My impression is that Eskom is still in a death spiral. We've been lucky, no loading since March. But it really is a very serious problem that this economy is run really for a minerals energy complex that just doesn't create jobs. So if we were to get the electricity to move over. Secondly, I don't think the economists at the Reserve Bank with these big numbers, they've calculated what we call a social cost of carbon. That is, when you emit a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, you're creating climate catastrophe. That's why the European Union has these tariffs. And I don't think they're factoring them in. When I read their analysis, there's no local pollution, no greenhouse gas emissions. It's a kind of very, let me call it a simplistic economic analysis. So I'd love the Reserve Bank to be able to say, actually, those predictions, which would, by the way, only start in January 2026, have to be set off against the gains from shutting down some of the most abusive energy glutton guzzling smelters.
What about the impact of carbon taxes imposed on South Africa's exports? What are the long-term effects there?
Well, the difference between what the Europeans now pay as a carbon tax, which is around $70 a ton, and what our companies pay locally, which is only about 40 US cents a ton. In other words, a vast, vast difference. That's the whole reason for the CBAM, this carbon border adjustment mechanism, is a way that the Europeans can say, we're not just going to outsource the pollution to the sort of dirty countries. South Africa, the third dirtiest emissions per person per unit of output. So that's what we want. We don't want them to be cheating. We want them to put, let me call it, a tax that makes the polluter pay. And what otherwise would happen is if we don't have such a tax, then all the European steel companies and aluminium companies and petrochem companies, they would just come here where they can pollute for next to nothing. And that would basically mean your basically climate politics in Europe just goes completely haywire. And all sorts of right-wingers would come in because jobs would be lost there. So I think, I mean, the big question is whether we can get the Just Energy Transition Partnership, also mostly from Europe, a little bit from the US and the UK. Can we get that to go to the steel workers, the petrochemical workers, the aluminium smelter workers, as we have a just transition, as we're supposed to be doing with the Eskom workers? That's the great challenge, whether the, let me call it, imperialist, protectionist West, which is going to be costing a few jobs, can then basically help those workers with retraining and get some really serious just transition work underway. It's been a complete farce for about 3 years. We've had a huge fund, 170 billion rand, promised and delivered as loans. We don't like loans, we'd expect grants, but there has just been very little delivery, and that's where workers have to stand up and work with communities and environmentalists.
More so because the main issue is Eskom, right, in terms of its generation. I understand it's around 80% of its electricity from burning coal, and the ripple effect is what's leading us to this conversation.
But partly it's also the process emissions. So when you have a smelter, you're putting, for example, for steel, you're putting the coal, which is a coal that isn't the thermal coal that goes into Eskom, but it's another coal that goes into the steelmaking with the iron ore. And as you smelt, as you put all of these together in the foundry, you get a lot of emissions. And that's where both the steel and aluminium sector really have very dirty emissions. And the overarching dilemma is we have way too much steel in the world. South Africa used to do 9 million tons a year. We're down to around 4 million because cheap Chinese competition. And that's really where I hope the CBAM, we could even apply it against Chinese imports of steel and protect some jobs that way. But I hope we get a little bit more rationality. We may need some eco-socialist planner. And the hope is that right now the European imperialists will actually inject a little bit more rationality with a price and make the polluter pays. We just must make sure that the people who are victimized, the workers, get other jobs as they're meant to do in a just transition.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on the conversation, helping us make some sense of that. Of course, Patrick Bond, a distinguished professor and director of the UJ Centre for Social Change, expanding on that conversation.